Do you want me to type something in?
Hello. Do I have to? Hello.
This could be a very, very, very long talk. You want to sit?
Hello.
It's picking up there.
Et là, est-ce que vous m'entendez? Y a-t-il du son? Parfait.
Parfait.
Okay.
Okay.
So we'll have to take
Which mic?
So it's just that one now, is it?
This?
Okay, so we've got none of these. No. No, il n'y a pas. There's none anymore. It's on that mic. Okay. Yeah. So if we gather closely around here. Yeah. All right.
It's on this one. We need to pick it up or not?
No, we're
No.
just going to have to talk loudly.
Okay.
We'll have no amplification.
Okay.
Kind of works with the house somehow.
Okay.
Okay, everyone. Welcome.
Come to the camera, James. You can.
Oh yeah,
You can have my seat.
You're very kind. Welcome to the
Send a picture.
second Design on seminar organized by the Centre de Recherche en Design. I think most of you should know the Centre de Recherche en Design by now. It's a research laboratory that connects ENS, l'École Normale Supérieure Paris-Saclay, with ENSI. So Armand Bahar, who should be joining us soon, is co-director with myself. It's a laboratory. You'll find the website online under the CRD, linked to the ENSI site. We're splitting the research into 4 research axes with this focus on the notion of the resource. I'll just quickly read out the axes. So the first research, group 1, design de dispositif. Dispositif is a very difficult word to translate into English. It's the direct translation's device, but it's not. In French is much more complicated than device. So I'll not get into that now. That's for another time. We've got design ecology, with sort of natural systems, systems of production, transformation of normative notions of design, looking at different types of materials, approaches to energy, ideas of low tech, etc. We've got the third axis is design and politics, working with citizens, collectives, and different institutions. And the fourth is a transversal axe, which is more classic design studies, history, epistemology to design, etc., etc. So each of these different axes are conducting research projects, and under each research axis, we have a number of doctoral students. We have 2 here. We have Valentin and Olivier doing both PhDs under the second axe, design ecology. So this talk session, we've got 2 of these a year where we invite very important people in the field to help us question the role of design today. This is the fundamental purpose of the talk. There is a kind of focus on design research, but for us, design and design research are essentially the same thing. There's not one moment when design becomes design research. They blur cunningly together. And so it's really people that are questioning the role of design today, looking at alternative methods, different value systems, new approaches, really challenging the roles of design that became established and entrenched during the 20th century, that have become increasingly revealed as problematic due to their approaches towards resources, to energy, to consumption and capitalism, etc. So that's really the purpose of the talk series. Alastair is the second person to join us. And I think Olivier will now do a formal introduction to yourself.
Okay.
Thank you.
Please, Olivier, take the grand chair.
Yeah, just before the very formal introduction of our guest, I just wanted to explain what we actually ask you to deal with for tonight, which is about resource design. So shortly in 3 points, what does it mean, resource design? It means actually first revitalizing ourselves, we designers, outside the market constraints. We feel within a field of practice and practice research we actually believe in, of course, but that has become increasingly problematic. And we want to actually use design towards another society project, where I'm sure Alastair will talk about it very soon. Resource designs also mean being resourceful, which means that from now on, the so-called natural, human, and information resources have to actually re-emerge in other forms, which can be terrestrial, personal, collective, technical, and digital potentials, by actually doing what we do in design, which means documenting, representing, criticizing, releasing, sharing, articulating, and so on, our potentials. And finally, designs must be a source of new relations to a sustainable, convivial, diverse worlds by our work and production, considering the fact that our work has to be comprehensive to the multiple situations we'd like to engage with, as well as our work has the capability to generate those words I am talking about. So now a quick introduction of Alastair Fuad-Luke. So Alastair is a facilitator, an educator, a writer, and activist exploring how design is applied to societal, ecological, economic, political, and educational issues. He has been full professor of design at the Free University of Bolzano in Italy between 2016 and 2021, and at the Aalto University in Finland between 2011 and 2015. As the general curator of the Porto Design Biennial in 2021 in Portugal, he developed the theme of alter realities, designing for the present. He works across public, social, and commercial sectors and has participated in diverse design-oriented European Union projects. So, welcome in Paris, Alastair.
Thank you, Olivier.
You.
Bon après-midi à tous. I want to introduce my companion for this afternoon before I start, because I cannot do it without this companion. So we together are going to deliver a little talk to you this afternoon. This, I can come over here, I can demonstrate. This is a houe in English, a houe in French, and in Portuguese, where I first bought my first enxada. So this actant, referring to Latour, of course, I am an actant, but so is the tool. And so are all the resources that go into the making of this tool and the use of this tool. Hence my title today. Maybe I can pass it around so people can feel my companion. I don't think there's any laws against that so far. So retooling our imaginaries. My talks are rather dense, but hopefully it can be shared on the platform as a PDF. There are many references there. And I believe this enxada, this humble hoe, can give us a really good discussion after my presentation. It is, of course, a tool that has been designed. We rarely talk about design in agriculture. And this afternoon, I want to bring those two topics together more. So I'm going to move pretty fast. Stop me if there's something you want to ask a question. And I guess on the chat here in Zoom, you can add your questions and they'll be picked up later by James and Olivier when we have our discussion. As designers, or design researchers, not making any distinction as you did, James, we have to think and act critically. And this has been said for many years. I could have gone to many quotations here. But I think Guy Bonasepi is a particularly apt one, because he talks about pensiero discorrente, an Italian expression. Basically, when we design, we should be critical in the way we think and the way we act, because what Bonasepi says is we have to ground our design in the domain of social discourse. Design for me has always been a social discipline. And thus, in the instance of politics, design for me is also political. You cannot be apolitical in design, because if you design without questioning the current political regime, you are supporting it. And if you question it, you may be asking different things of the existing regime. Fundamentally, underneath this, Bonasepi said we have to ask in what sort of society do members of that society wish to live? And I bring my actant with me here, my enxada, to maybe open that question a little bit. I just give a brief timeline here. I would never say I had a career, because I'm still not quite sure what I'm doing. I'm always on a journey somewhere. But certainly since the late 90s, I've been putting different adjectives in front of the word design. Adjectives, of course, describe the noun. Design also I see as designing. To me, it's an active practice. So I've been using lots of, well, in the 1980s, I ran an ecological landscape design company. I employed landscape architects. I was the ecologist then. But I've been challenging this way we talk about design: eco-design, design for sustainability, slow design, co-design, open design, eco-social design, relational design. And I just have a new book published called Post-Normal Design, which is a tongue-in-cheek challenge to what is normal design, of course. Well, but I'm basing my talk around this, this object, an object with a illustrious and great history. I have 3 sections to the talk. Because this was prompted by the poster, you sent the poster to him and it said slow design and activism. I thought, yes, I know a bit about both of those. So I went back to an old talk I gave in 2006. I started first talking about slow design in 2002, which is a remarkable 20 years ago now. And I think these slides I picked from that talk then say something about the connection we might be able to make between the houe and society. You will be able to answer this question better than me at the end of my presentation. Then I go on to talk about the houe, because I think we need to know it better. We need to really know what we're looking at in terms of an object. And then I talk in the last section about redesigning agricultures. Always plural for me, you don't have one agriculture. And I put a hyphen between agri and culture, because I believe that every agriculture is supported underneath by a culture, and the two inform each other. Even agribusiness, which is done on a global scale, these huge companies that are trading across all continents, vertical supply chains, they have a culture too. So that's the structure of my talk. So I'm going to go through a little bit more quickly now. This is my talk in 2016. Apologies for ugly PowerPoint graphics, but that's how we did it then in 2006. So any graphic designers amongst you, try and just read the words and try and get beyond the bad design. There's a wonderful book produced by, he was a brand expert actually, called Will Murray, produced a book called Brandstorm. And these diagrams are from his book. As a brand specialist creating brands, he was interested in our timeline of how we framed our economies and where we were going. So if you look at his economic folk on the left-hand side there, this is Murray, he said we went from tribal economies, which are based on survival, then to rural economies, which are based on a form of civilization. Industrial economy was based on learning. Consumer economy is based on lifestyle. Knowledge economy was based on communication. Human economy on individuality, and intelligence economy on being. Of course, he put a question mark because he wrote this book in the millennium, 2000, also 22 years ago. And he wasn't sure about the human economy, the intelligence economy. I think the point I'd like to make is that all these economies, it's not a linear progression. All these economies exist in the world. There are tribal economies. There are still industrial economies. We don't do so much industry here in Europe now, heavy industry. That's moved over to other parts of the world, but in China, they know what heavy industry is, okay? It just moved somewhere else. We're not doing less heavy industry, it just isn't here in Europe as much. And if you look at rural economies, they're all over the world. Actually, farming, 50% of our agriculture in the world is still done by subsistence farmers. They would recognize the rural economy that Murray described. On top of that, I put Charles Jenks, a writer about architecture and architectural theory. He had this space-time model, and he said somewhere around about 1450, we lost the idea of cyclic time. Cyclic time. We went straight into linear time and progress. Then in the 1960s, there was an attempt to rediscover cyclic time as opposed to linear time. I have a few more slides on time. I think these are my original slides, and I've just highlighted in yellow some things that jumped out from me rereading these slides after many, many years. I haven't been to these slides. So I've highlighted the things in yellow. I don't want to go into too much detail, but I thought this was an interesting framing of time and how we construct mentally our idea of an economy. And my point here is that all those economies exist together. It's not that we have a linear, not everybody's in Silicon Valley. We still have 2 billion people who haven't joined the internet yet. Okay, yeah.
I don't understand the link between the human body and the model. Is there a link between...
Well, this isn't my diagram, so I'm explaining on behalf of Murray. Okay, it's a diagram from his book. I think he just put the human there to say, look, this is the tribal economy lasted for 100,000 years, and the economies he proposed are getting shorter and shorter. The knowledge economy only came out as an idea relatively recently, before the millennium, and he didn't even know how long these economies would last. Of course, these are fictitious because he was predicting. So I think it's the idea that these economies lasted for a long time and now they're getting progressively shorter. Maybe we have networked economy now. I don't know. You can add other adjectives. I was trying to define slow activism then, and I still like this phrase, slow positivism. Of course, we can't have slow without having fast in the world. I was never anti-fast. I was more pro-slow, if that makes sense. But slow positive involved slow localism. Organizations like Slow Food, Slow Cities, Slow Environmentalism, the Sloth Club. I set up Slow. I was involved in Slow Lab, which still exists today. So this was a way of trying to reposition slow as something positive. From the futurists onwards, it was all about speed. And we're still in that speed, I would argue. When we're networked today and we're multitasking, we're still in that concept of progress as linear and speed. This is from several sources, but I think we can go right back to Stuart Brand and his project, The Clock of the Long Now. This is a talk about layers of knowledge in society, and he proposed that the fast layers of knowledge are art and fashion and commerce and infrastructure, and the slow layers are nature, culture. Then I see this structure and I think, well, maybe culture is also a pretty fast layer. Depends which kind of culture you're talking about. But the idea here was that slow involved some shared and multidisciplinary and particular cultural and geographic contexts, and it was humble. And we're talking about how knowledge is constructed here. There are different kinds of time, of course. This is from classic Greek philosophy, chronos and kairos, qualitative time. There is a qualitative time, I believe, even when we're working with a tool like this, we can actually multitask. Having used one of these on a basic task, your mind starts doing other things at the same time. You go into, you know, this expression flow from Sensi Mihaly, the Hungarian. So when you go into flow, you lose consciousness of our linear progress of time. So this idea of time of opportunity, chance, and mischance, a quality time. But there are many views of time, and we forget because we come from a European culture. So you can look through this list here. There's a particular French expression. Perhaps you'll tell me if this is correct. Durée, whether it means a lived time, an experienced time. What does it mean to you, native French speakers? Durée. Lasting? Yes. Okay. Something that's deeper, perhaps. Well, this is the translation I got, a live time and experience time, which implies you have to be embedded in it a little bit. But if you look down through the list, you see all sorts of different residence time. Scientists can talk about how long something spends time in a system. If you look down to Sudan, they actually measure time based on cows, because cows are a primary source of income. So they measure on milking cycles and fertility cycles of the cows. If you go to various parts of India, they will measure time based on the scent of flowers, when a particular scent arrives during the year. Moral time, thinking 7 generations ahead. There are many ideas of time, I think. As designers too, you heard that my biennale was called Alter Realities, Designing the Present. We often talk in design about fictional futures, but actually acting and designing in the present already alters the future. So I like Brian Eno's definition of now. All the things I can affect in a certain time frame, I shall call now. And then we have to think, what is our time frame? Is our time frame related to our family's time frame, our parents, our children? Is it related to our generation's time frame? Now, this is a wonderful book that inspired me many, many years ago with this phrase here. This is from Anne Klein. It's a book called The Hut of One's Own, Life Outside the Circle of Architecture. And she simply asked, what rituals of delay could nourish us? Or have the virtual realities of film and television made ever real-time tedious, and therefore slowed up time unbearable? Today, because she wrote this book in 1998, today we could talk about film and television and networked time, or digital time. But I like this question, what rituals of delay could nourish us? I quite like being delayed in my day. It gives me another way of being in the world. I produced a manifesto in 2003. I'm only going to read out bits of it but you'll have the slides afterwards, James. You can, Olivier, you can circulate them. But I like this word I created. It's not an English language word, endurability. When we get onto the story of the houe, the enxada, we can recognize maybe what this phrase endurability means. The ability of designed objects, spaces and images to have persistent, long-term socio-cultural relevance by remaining physically, spiritually, mentally, and emotionally durable. We don't live in an age of durability. Spiritual, mental, physical, or any kind sense of durability. We are very flighty. We don't stay with things very long. So I saw this word that I wrote a long time ago, and I think it's relevant to today's talk. I had some philosophy and principles then. I'm only going to highlight one now, which is design encouraging a long view. If only our political classes had a long view, we wouldn't be in such trouble. We lack the idea of a long view. It's interesting, if you look at a country like China, they've always had their 5, 10, 20, 50-year plan. Although we might argue it's a very different political climate, they've always had a very long view. And this is something we're lacking here in our European context, and indeed in many other parts of the world. And the other thing I felt with slow design in those days, that it has to permit evolution, development of the design outcomes. Too often we think that this design is fixed. It's not. But I think the citizens, us, we've forgotten how to play with this. But also maybe, you know, this box here, it's sealed, okay? We can't play with it. This is a deliberate protectionism and a deliberate obsolescence. But we should come back to the idea that the design, when it moves into the human hand, has the potentiality to evolve. Of course, we can deal with old ideas like affordance in design. Affordance is what we can do with a designed object. And if you give all these objects to children, they'll find far more uses for them than we adults can, because they're not limited by the idea of function. And their imaginaries are still open and still fertile. And then I saw slow design as catalyzing behavioral change and socio-cultural transformation. When I think I wrote these words back in 2003, and then I try and reflect on, well, how far have we come along the path or paths? I'm not sure, but we can discuss that afterwards. And I had these images and I selected these are only 4 of the categories that I picked. There were 8 categories in my original slow manifesto: tradition, ritual, experiential, evolved, slowness, eco-efficiency, open source, and one funny category called technology. I can't remember what I put in it. And I picked case studies and examples that I thought fitted this manifesto. So I posit that there about slow design because I think something of what I was saying there is relevant to the next part of my talk, my presentation. I called it the humble hoe, because the hoe doesn't rush around saying, look at me. Actually, it's quite a background object in many ways. Well, in some cultures. In others, it's not. In the neighbors where we live in the north of Portugal, in a rural area, in a mountain area called the Minho. It borders with Galicia in northwestern Spain. You'll see many people walking around with an enxada, the people that are still farming directly on the land. And it'll be something to lean on when you're talking to your neighbor, or something to pull the lemon tree down to pick the lemon, or something to carry a big mound of grass for your horse, or something you're cutting or cleaning a water channel. It's just with the person all the time. And you'll see why. Here, of course, we have a simple object in design terms anyway. There's 2 pieces here. One is steel and the other is wood. But it's not a simple object when we start to tell the stories, because I believe the enxada has many stories. It has a history going from Mesopotamia to the present day. It's still used today by millions of people. So we cross from Mesopotamia, Asia, Africa, every continent. Of course, in the European Iron Age, this became a much easier implement to create. Anybody who could work iron could create this implement. It went through modifications in the medieval period in the 19th and 20th century. It has a very strong symbolic meaning. I don't know when I held it up like that, any of you felt a bit threatened, because we do have this image too of peasants revolting with their tools, you know, held above their head. And I'm going to show you some images. It is related to a peasantry. Actually, in British culture, to call someone a peasant is an insult. It means you're not very well educated, you're a bit stupid, a bit lazy, you're a peasant, okay? But peasants actually created our prosperity. Without peasants, we couldn't be where we are today. If I say a peasant is somebody that has extensive experience of the land through simple tools, a kind of knowledge, I'm going to talk about different forms of knowledge in a minute, but a kind of knowledge that we have totally lost in general, maybe you wouldn't call them derogatory peasants, but it is a tool associated with the proletariat and subsistence farmers. It's also a tool with the symbolic meaning of resistance and protest. It's a design tool, it's an individual tool, and I'm going to show that it's a collective tool. It's about soil care, working the soil. My limited experience with this tool in Portugal, because before I never used an enxada. I've only been living in Portugal the last 2 years, this time anyway, I lived there before. But the way you work the soil with it is very different. And I would argue it's a very efficient practice, much more efficient than the spade. I think a day's work with the spade would make you tireder than a day's work with the enxada, but maybe we should test that out. It's just a theory. Ease of use then is important. When you're using a tool all day, every day, and you're really transforming the soil and the landscape, you need a tool that is easy to use. It's also been used in small-scale farming, and it is still used in subsistence farming all over the world. So bioorganic agriculture, permaculture, urban agriculture, and I should add subsistence agriculture. So its history, the first of these tools, of course, didn't have iron. We didn't invent iron until relatively recently in our human history. So this Egyptian tool on the left-hand side is made of wood, but it's following the same principles. You go into the earth in this direction, and you pull towards you. This is a Roman fork in the middle. It's an enxada still, and there are many different designs to the enxada. And this is from a dynasty in China. I can't remember the date now, but also it's a simple tool to turn the earth. This is a famous painting, at least here in France. I have to thank Magda for introducing me to this picture here. Man with a hoe. When Jean-François Millet took it to the gallery, they rejected it. It's miserable. It's too realistic. It shows poverty. It shows hard work. It shows a man almost broken. Well, in a facetious way, I might say his shaft of his hoe was too short, so he's probably really suffering from having a short length handle on his hoe. But people just didn't want to see this. They didn't want to see the reality. Let me just ask you, when was the last time you saw someone in real time and real space using this implement? Yeah.
Last weekend.
Last weekend, and for us, last weekend, we were planting some trees, okay? So, yes, it's not common. And I was thinking yesterday afternoon, as we were on Paris, we had a short conversation before this talk. If I walked around with the enxada, and people would look, right? And maybe a bit suspicious. Of course, the enxada is well known in some cultures. The hoe. This is Cuba. You want to know what a post-petroleum future looks like? Visit Cuba. Cuba hasn't had, it's had 10% of the oil that we've had in the last 50 years. So they still use manual tools, individually and collectively. You see all these guys with hoes here? And urban agriculture, we like to think it's a new thing, okay? A trendy thing. Urban agriculture actually goes back to medieval and earlier periods where food was grown in the cities in case your city was sieged. So it's not so new. But in some cultures, this implement is an everyday tool. And if you were walking on the streets of Havana, I don't think anybody would look at you strangely if you were walking along with this tool. But for sure, here on the streets of Paris, maybe I would have got a little tap on the shoulder from one of your gendarmes saying, "What's your intention?" Well, digging soil, of course. And I found this picture recently. You'll know that Xi Jinping was made absolute ruler of China by default, okay? And he was in a province here where, well, his father was part of Mao's revolution. And then, of course, he fell out of favor and his father was a criminal. And so his son, Xi Jinping, was sent to the countryside and re-educated in the countryside. But this is at the time when he was rising up through the provincial ranks of the Communist Party. But what is he carrying on his shoulder? He's carrying a hoe. This is not accidental. This is a great symbolic thing. It means I'm still connected with the people who work the land. In the flag of Mozambique, you have a book, a star, a gun, and a hoe. Well, I don't know when the graphic designer was doing that, what was going through them or why they chose this. And I would like to know more about the story of this flag. How recent is the flag, for instance? I don't know. I guess the history is there and we could go and read about it. But it's there. This tool is so important in this culture of Mozambique. It is there as part of a national identity. So I go to the area where I'm now living, part of my time, between this northern area of Portugal and Porto, which is still in the north, but an hour and a half's drive south. It's a mountainous area. You can see the terraces of land here. And it's near Paredes de Cora, where I live. And this is from an archive in Ponte de Lima, of old photographs. I talked earlier of the enxada being an implement used individually and collectively. And what they're doing here, they all cut the soil until they can lift the whole turf. This is manual ploughing. Ploughing is to invert a turf so that the grass is underneath the old soil. And this work requires coordinated strength. And this is how they turned the smaller fields, because they weren't even workable with oxen. You cannot turn the oxen round so easily. They're doing the same thing on the right here. And then you see this field on the left. This is from also this book here, which is a really interesting ethnographic study of agriculture in Portugal, and also an economic study. And the whole village is turned out on the left to turn this field over. So this is the enxada working collectively. In this same book, across Portugal, from the Azores in the mid-Atlantic, Madeira, which James knows well, the Alentejo in the south, all the way up to the northern regions of Portugal, the enxada is not the same design. The design changes. Why does the design change? The design changes because the soil conditions change. The agriculture changes. The needs change. There are special enxadas in the south for clearing water channels. You can use this enxada to do water channels too, because channeling water in the south, the legacy of the Moors and the Arab culture there, and their fantastic collection and redistribution of water, created some special tools. So there are hundreds of designs of enxada here for very specific tasks. And I would argue the designs are different too, because you might be using this for 4 hours a day or 6 hours a day. Imagine the responsibility of designing a tool which people use for this number of hours, where their physical body is the engine. It's a huge responsibility to get the design right. But the design of enxadas is alive and well, because there's a Spanish company. That's where I bought my enxada, not in Portugal. I bought it in Portugal from a Spanish company, Bolota. Bolota means acorn. I don't know how old the company is. This is just one page. They have 50, 60 different designs of enxada. And I want to go and visit them actually, and actually ask, well, what is each one used for? Because I've shown you images of people just turning soil, but clearly there are many ways to turn soil. There are many ways to work with the soil and do different things. And I thought it's very interesting. This is the front page of Bolota. Well, you tell me what's interesting. I think I know what's interesting there, but what are you seeing? This is their homepage. What's interesting? On peut parler en français et anglais.
You don't need to actually see the entire tool to understand that it's enxada.
Yes, that's one thing. What else are we seeing here?
Yeah, actually everything but enxada.
Yeah, you're seeing everything but the enxada. But what struck me, this is a highly contemporary image. Okay, it's a highly contemporary image. It's not showing some old agricultural guy with his flat cap who's been using enxada all his lifetime. This is a young woman in ordinary clothes with a stufa, a greenhouse in the background, with a modern house in the background. Is this their main clients? I don't think so, but this is the image. And then you go on the other pages and they'll have a man, but the people they're choosing to show with enxada is not the generation I've just shown you. It's not. It's a younger generation. And I'd like to come back to this point in our conversation about our role as design as a social symbolic act, because there is some social awareness here about who uses enxada. Of course, they know the market very well. So I come on to this last section of my talk, so I can leave enough time for us to have a good discussion and to receive questions from James and Olivier. Redesigning agricultures. At this point, you can see that I like hyphens a lot, you know, but hyphens can also disturb words. And I think all designing at some level is usually redesigning. Like Nelson Goodman says, we make the world, yes, but we really remake the world. It's back to this idea of limits. We're in a finite planet. So we're usually remaking the world. I base this next section on 3 relatively recent published books. On the left, we have a book from the Biennale, which was called the Alta Journal. We did 5 issues just for the Biennale over 2 months. The middle book is from a project I did in South Tyrol. Alto Adige is the Italian name of the province, South Tyrol in English. It's in the northeast of Italy. It used to belong to Austria, but 100 years ago was given to Italy. And I did a project there. I'll show you a couple of slides from that project. And the last book also came out of the post-normal design, Emergent Approaches Towards Plural Worlds. I think a long, long time ago, when I wrote the Eco-Design Handbook in 2002, I declared myself as a design pluralist. I do not think we can have universal designs that work everywhere. Remember, I trained as an ecologist, and ecology is not the same over the world. I can see the same plants in Portugal, but they're not doing the same things that they would do in the UK. Same species, but they operate in a different way. So I've always believed in plural worlds. That's why I get a little bit disturbed when people have these very mono-ideological views of the world. They're deeply disturbing to me because I see a plural world. So this is the first book, and I wrote an essay called Designing Towards the Symposium. I'll describe what I mean by that later. This is the second book where I had a lot of case studies and different essays from designers as practitioners, artists as practitioners. This particular project, for instance, was from future farmers. They went around the countryside in Abruzzo in central Italy with this Trojan horse, this wooden horse. And on the inside of the horse, they had a blackboard space. And the farmers wrote their knowledge on the inside of. Then they moved it to the next village collectively. They had to get people to move it. And the farmers from that village would come along, they'd be curious, and they would also add their thoughts and information. It was a tool to gather stories, and a successful one. And this book came from these 4 colloquia we did online. And I'll just read the description here. This book challenges normalized ways of designing within the current global neoliberal economic situation by proposing the concept of post-normal design as an exploratory attempt to confront the damage and to reframe both the discipline and the profession. So there's some provocations in here for sure. So in this section, I have 3 propositions. There's something I want to put forward. Maybe you don't agree, but for me, it's gathered a bit of weight in my head. The Great Separation, then I want to talk about how we reorientate to the Great Separation, and then how we materialize plural worlds. And we will come back eventually to the enxada, the hoe. So the Great Separation, when Albrecht Dürer painted these wonderful things, of course he was commissioned to paint portraits, and he was quite a rebel, Dürer, we know his work. But he painted these 2 common subjects, a piece of turf, a piece of grass. I can actually recognize many of the plants in it. He painted it so well. We have annual meadow grass, we have plantains. I can recognize the plants in it. And this, of course, on the right is a hare, a leveret. Most people in Europe could also recognize these things because most people, when he was painting this, were living on the land. Today in Europe, well, then it was 90% of people living on the land, directly living off the land. What is the figure today? Any idea how many people are living in the rural areas of Europe? Any guesses?
20%.
Okay. Any more guesses? It's 50. Yeah, half of Europe doesn't live in a city. To frame it another way. But then it was much higher. And these were people had knowledge of these. People knew what the fur of a hare felt like. Many people probably could skin one, because when you went to the taglio, the butchers, they gave you the whole hare. So there was an intimate knowledge with the land. This is my point with these two. We've had many agricultural revolutions. The first one, of course, Mesopotamia on the left here, Neolithic. The second one, Arabic, which is rarely talked about, but the Arabs really, in the context of Europe, completely revolutionized agriculture. And then we moved into what I've called the third European colonial agricultural revolution from 1500 to 1900. And this is when the great separation began. When European countries went out to colonize other countries, they radically changed how they did agriculture. Some of the systems in Europe took much longer to change, but when they experimented in other people's countries, they radicalized the agriculture. Then we had the fourth British Revolution, which is all about mechanization. So in my country, 90% of the people left the land between the late 1700s to 1830, 1850, 90% of the people left the agricultural land. It's so nice in Portugal because still people, I say, have 1 foot in the countryside and 1 foot in the city. We lost that in the UK 170 years ago, 190 years ago. Not many people have a foot in the countryside in the UK. And then we have a fifth agricultural revolution from 1915 onwards, caused by the Great War and the idea of European famine. A new phase of mechanization and intensive farming started. Of course, we had the industrial revolutions on top. Sorry, I wanted to say something here. You've all heard about the Anthropocene now. Has anybody not heard about the Anthropocene as a concept? Well, the first thing I want to say about that is we're still in disagreement about when it started. Did it really start when we stopped becoming nomadic? Because the minute you stop moving, of course, you cause a lot more damage locally. I don't know. Is it when the first radioactive isotope went global from Nagasaki, Hiroshima? The golden spike is what the geologists talk about, and they're still in disagreement. When did the Anthropocene start? But many people have criticized this term, Anthropocene. All humans responsible for our present predicament? No. I don't think so. Not equally. There are two other terms I think that we should focus on here. The Capitalocene, which is related to this idea of European colonial settlerism or suprematism of the Europeans, of course, globally. And it's related to Christian religious power in new geopolitical areas, and the Plantationocene. There's a book by Jason Moore, where he defines the Capitalocene, a multi-species assemblage, a world ecology of capital, power, and nature. And the Plantationocene, the devastating transformation of diverse kinds of human-tended farms, pastures, and forests into extractive and enclosed plantations relying on slave labor and other forms of exploited, alienated, and usually spatially transported labor. This definition was created at a conference of anthropologists. Donna Haraway, Anna Singh, and others created this definition, the Plantationocene. The Plantationocene is very important today because we can look at agribusiness, which is a globalized form of industrial agriculture, uses all these techniques. I'm going fast because we don't have so much time, and maybe you've got questions and thinking, I disagree. Okay, we can bring that back later. But this terminology to me is more precise, the Capitalocene and the Plantationocene, than the Anthropocene. Because agriculture still has a huge impact on carbon dioxide, on methane, on the use of energy. We don't talk about it much. Even at COP, they're probably not talking about it so much, but agriculture is fundamental to existence. This is what this Plantationocene, Capitalocene produces. This is a warehouse of soybean. You know the stories, the cutting of the virgin rainforest to grow monoculture of soybean. Arturo Escobar, who wrote Designs for the Pluriverse, he's an anthropologist by training, but he's writing more and more about design these days. He calls it a terricide. a killing of the earth, or an ecocide, because the only thing the soybean growers want to grow is soybeans. To get a mountain of soybeans like that, you have to kill a lot of other things. The quantities of pesticides and fertilizers tied to this is part of the green revolution thinking in agriculture. You can produce these new varieties, but you have to put a lot of fertilizer in and a lot of pesticides. And this is also linked to a form of extractivism. Maybe I don't have too much time to spend on this today, but Mackenzie Walk's book, Capital is Dead. Is This Something Worse? Is worth reading because it talks about new classes of power. And we have to talk about power. And maybe we should talk about the power of the enxada when we come on to the discussion as a symbolic tool. So Guy Standing, who's cited in Mackenzie Walk's book, talks about 7 new kinds of classes: plutocracy, salariat, professions, I guess we're in that category, professional and technical, working class, precariat, unemployed, lumpen precariat. And Mackenzie Walk talks about vectorialists, oligarchs, hackers, rentiers, people who rent properties, and CEOs. What is a vectorialist? Have you heard of this form of class? Okay. Classic vectorialist would be Jeff Bezos of Amazon. He doesn't own a single factory. He takes information through Amazon.com. He takes orders as well, but he takes a lot of information on personal profiles and he turns it into orders. Orders that then he asks factories to produce. You don't need to own a factory today. That's 19th century thinking, right? You need to be able to generate the market and move the information where you want. And that's the vectorialist. They gather information and they use the information and they move the information where they want. So we end up with things like this: social injustice, 0 hours contracts, indentured labor. We end up too with I think this is part of the crisis, we're in a loss of, these are local languages that have been lost across Europe. If you lose language, you lose culture. Biodiversity loss, I really believe we're in the 6th great extinction. And if climate warming accelerates faster, which is going to, I think, we will expect other species to disappear. It's not just climate, it's urbanization and our agriculture. And temperature increase. Maybe you don't know, but there's a hot spot in Lisbon, in the south of Portugal there. And in Galicia in the northwest is also, wherever you see a red dot, it's been warming 3 to 4 degrees in the last 40 years. This is all from data gathered around Europe. And Eastern Europe, well, and the Alps, they're super hot places. Climate warming has never been equal. It's hotter in other places. So how do we reorientate to that? It's difficult. This is a local project I did. I asked the question, I work with small farmers in South Tyrol. What could a farm be? I ran many, many participatory workshops, and I wanted to find out what they thought about the future. So we'd always do the workshops on the farm. I would take the workshops to a farm. This is a food timeline we did for South Tyrol. Somewhere where that guy is standing, there's a line called Now. And to the right of him, or to his left, sorry, we're designing future foods. We designed the meals in the past, we drew them on a plate. So typical meals of South Tyrol, they changed, of course. And now we got the new meals coming here. The farmers weren't very optimistic. They said we might be growing food that other people make into food pills. They were really pessimistic, I have to say. In these workshops, we were doing with lots of kinds of knowledge, and I want to come back to trying to understand later as we have a discourse about what kind of knowledge are we engaging with when we work with this tool. I think a lot of knowledge is encultured and tacit knowledge. Tacit, of course, means we have to touch it, feel it. So there's theoretical knowledge in the top left, there's procedural practical knowledge, and there's experiential knowledge, and this is your encultured knowledge. But then it's also situated. We can't sometimes take the knowledge of working the soil here in Paris and transpose it to working in the north of Portugal or in South Tyrol. Sometimes that it's situated. And it's something we cannot remove from its environmental or the context of the environment, the wider environment. So what forms of knowledge might we talk about here? We did some projects in the university where I was, Free University of Bolzano, where we're looking at the biological cycle, and we're taking agricultural waste and we're making new packaging from apple waste. A lot of apples run there. We're taking 60 tons of wool, which is thrown away in South Tyrol, and making new products. We're growing hemp there for the first time. Italy was one of the biggest hemp producers in Europe in the 18th, 19th century. Now they hardly produce any. All the hemp's grown in China. So we were trying to revitalize that. And I used to use this diversity triangle. If we really want to protect our future, how do we balance anthropocentric diversity? I'm all in favor of looking at the human race as a pluralistic expression of a species. How do we balance agricultural diversity? In the turn of the century in UK, we used to have hundreds and hundreds of varieties of wheat. Now, every year, the ministry produces 5 varieties of wheat that farmers should be growing. So we have a reduction in diversity in agriculture. We need to look after our biodiversity. I think future design courses, if we're talking about the future of design too, there's a future wherever these Venn circles cross over, to be designing to look at the multi-species diversity. By that, I mean, of course, not just human, but our diversity with other living things. So we have to move into the future caring for these 3 types of diversity in order that we get what's called a preferable future life. This is a future's cone. Of course, we've had past modes of what I call regenerative design. I mentioned before, permaculture, agriculture, urban agriculture, eco-villages, ecological design. We have tried to do it, but it hasn't scaled up. It hasn't scaled up. So we have a real challenge to balance these 3 spheres, I think, in the future. We should all pay attention to this economic model, because if you're economics, so we could talk about what is the economic model around the enxada. It might be microeconomics, but there is an economic model here. Of course there is. The economic model, according to Kate Raworth, if you look at economy as a donut, don't let people fall in the middle, in the hole, because this means they've fallen out of society. They're no longer cared for by society. And don't run an economy where you break the ecosystems. Don't go outside the donut. All designing today should pay attention to this model. It should also pay attention to this model. This is by Gibson Graham, a fantastic duo of economists that produce many alternative, heterodox ways of thinking about the economy. The economy, we might all recognize, is the floating bit at the top of the iceberg. It's the wage labor, commodity markets, capitalist enterprise. But that cannot exist without all these forms of economy here, which are often not put in the classical accounting sheet of a neoliberal economy. They're just not, there's no columns for them, okay? Where's the column for breastfeeding? There isn't a column for breastfeeding in macroeconomics today. But if you don't have somebody breastfeeding, you don't have a child that grows well, and you don't have a new worker for the next generation. So there are many things here, and this is another area where design can look at: DIY, farmers markets, gleaning. Any idea what gleaning is? We've had several conversations on gleaning recently. Gleaning, this is the poorest level of people. After the crop had been harvested, you allowed people in the field to glean. They picked up the individual seeds. This is gleaning. You could argue there's some classes of job today, the precariat, it's a kind of gleaning, really. You're picking up the pieces after everybody's got their edible crop. Gleaning.
The great film from Agnieszka.
Huh? On gleaning, yes, we saw it.
Just needs unmuting.
Okay. You'll have to rejoin. There's a few slides I've gone through. If you've not heard my voice, I apologize for that. Has it gone up? Okay. We have to embed this idea of design justice. It's growing a community of practice that aims to ensure a more equitable distribution of design's benefits and burdens. We have an assumption in design that everything we design gives a benefit. No, it's not true. We design many things that create burdens for others, humans and beyond human. So we have to think about how we distribute benefits and how we prevent burdens through design. This is a simple idea of design justice. And we're still not moving on. I don't know why. No, the talk is stuck, I think. Only a few more slides and then we're finished. It's a pity.
Yeah.
It's a pity because the punchline, of course, comes in the next few slides. Okay, so just to show you some case study, because we cannot talk about design without showing what is produced. And I go back to that very first quotation I gave you from Guy Bonasepi about critical thinking. And these are all projects around design and agriculture. This is about creating community drinks. These are drinks where people go out into the countryside and forage. Foraging is a bit like gleaning, but you're taking it directly from unmanaged nature, let's say. This is a website created by a master student in Bolzano where she retold the stories of farmers. It's called Farmfluencers, which I thought was a nice title. And she lived with the farmers. She did a lot of ethnographic research, and she realized that these farmers on the high Alps, they walk around with a radio. This is how they hear the world. And so she did a podcast that could get through an internet radio. And she very cleverly interviewed the farmers who were farming in alternative ways. So she gave them, through her design, a mouthpiece. This is other farmers who design for each other. These are specialist tools, which are shared in an open design way. It's L'Atelier Paysan, a French organization. So for biofarming, sometimes you can't buy the tools on the normal market because they don't make them. If you're testing out new experimental crops, you can't use the standard tools. This is about looking at old grains in Norway, in Oslo, with future farmers in the Flatbread Society. They built a new bread oven, a communal bread oven, in a structure representing boats, as you can see. They brought together a lot of farmers who grew the old varieties of wheat in Norway. And these varieties of wheat originated from Mesopotamia. She did another project, Amy Franceschini, where she sailed the boat all the way back to Mesopotamia with these old grains, sort of completing the circle of the story. We need to take care of these old grains. One little side story, there's some valleys in the high Alps where they grow mixed crops. That is, they have short grain and tall grain. Some grain that does well in dry years, but it's in one field. I can't remember what the technical term is for this. It's the same species and same variety, but they've learned different habits. So if you get a bad season, you'll still get a reasonable crop. And there's some valleys where they make special bread. You can only get it in these valleys. I think this is something to think about, whether through the enxada, we can think more about specialization. This idea of terroir, which is of course very French, but why can't we have terroir for every single thing we produce? And they were looking at some of these issues. This is a mapping of alternative food networks in an essay in the book by Chris Croyce. And it's very interesting, the alternative food networks in different cultures. Well, maybe we need some Parisian air. The alternative food networks are all organized differently. But how are they organized? How could you be inspired? Well, we had a graphic designer mapping them. This is a project looking at new livelihoods in the future in a valley near Trentino, Vallegrina, where they looked at different ways the community could work individually and collectively together to create new types of work. We don't have time to pick them out, but maybe I have community bakeries. There have been several experiments in the Alps region in the northeast to have people going around with a bicycle and a portable bread oven to bring communities together. And of course, it was designed as a lightweight oven. There are all ideas around growing local vegetables, art in the open, local seed banks, low carbon mobility. But this was produced in discussion with the local communities there. We also can talk about what do we mean by care? How do we materialize designers' care? Is this a form of materializing care through design? If you see somebody using this tool and caring for the soil, I would answer yes, it is a form of caring. If you design a good tool here and it's used in a good practice. We should also talk about, these last slides are about what I call social infrastructuring, how we use design as a tool to build social infrastructures. This last slide here is about ecological infrastructuring. We don't have to have monocultures. This was drilled using satellite GPS positioning, a conventional drill to drill grain seed. But some of the drill things were drilling wildflower seed. Of course, the drill had to stop and start because the tractor was doing straight lines. We can do it. We can actually, so wherever you see the white lines there, wildflowers were sown. So you have corridors of wildflower activity. You have a lot more insects. You don't have to apply the pesticides. This is being researched now by the agricultural institutions across Europe. We can also go on to this idea of ecological infrastructure in an urban setting here. I've been delighted the last 12 hours in Paris, walking around the center here and seeing how many parks, but not one of them is being used as an edible space. Not here in the center anyway. And this is a possibility. Maybe in a few years' time, I could be walking my enxada down one of the boulevards and people say, what are you growing? What we need is assemblages of care. I think design and designing as a discipline, if it's open and not protective, can bring many people around the table or many people around the tool. And I end with this quote from Jacques Rancière. You don't need any introduction to him, but I've always liked this idea that he proposed. He was actually writing about the arts world, but I think the same applies to the design world or any world of cultural production. Aesthetics refers to distribution of the sensible, that determines a mode of articulation between forms of action, production, perception, and thought. I hope I've introduced all of those in this talk. Action, production, perception, and thought. So this is a question I'm posing to us here. Can we redesign the houe here, the houe, the enxada, to help retool our imaginaries, to engage us to actively change our distribution of the sensible? If we leave the distribution of the sensible to others, that's the world we get. So I leave that question on the podium, along with my actant, the enxada, and I look forward to a fruitful discussion. Thank you. Merci bien. And to the online audience, apologies for any small technical interruptions. But also, I think we want your questions. I guess they can go in the chat. Yes?
Yes, anybody in the audience in the Zoom chat, probably easier if you type questions into the chat box and then we can ask them rather than trying to go through the mic nightmare again.
You want to do chairs here or what?
I guess we'll put chairs.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'll bring a chair over. Where would you like?
I think you look good there.
Okay.
Women's
I come up with it. Yeah.
That's the problem with Zoom, isn't it? Yeah. Let's push that back a little bit.
We want wide angle zoom here. That's it.
Okay.
Well,
Do you want to start?
okay, I want to start. Yeah, I have kind of a general question because you were showing us further the timeline with all the notions you actually like to work with, like eco-design and design and eco-social design, etc. And so now it seems that you are more thinking of human and more than human relationships. Or that's actually the title you gave to your 3 last books. So I was wondering, how did you shift from slow design to this? Or is it maybe slow design which is now incorporated in these questions? Because actually slow design is explicitly talking about slow design and design, of course. And more than human relations, it's more within maybe a literature paradigm, or within anthropology also. So I was wondering how you figured this and how you deal with this.
Well, I think as designers and design researchers, we are very late to many debates. And I would argue that the debate on our understanding of the non-human, other than human, beyond human, whatever terminology you want to apply, is rather late too. Not even in classic books like Papernak's Design for the Real World did he really address his book is also anthropocentric. So I think we're very late to that debate. I'm also wondering why it took me so long as a former ecologist to get back to thinking about the relations we create through design. But I think that's in a bizarre way, because when I entered the design world as an educator, I'd never worked as a designer. I trained myself to try and understand what eco-design, and I wrote for 3 years in a journal which existed in the late 90s in the UK called Ecological Design. And I wrote in that for 3 years to try and understand how my expertise up to that point, ecology, could be linked to design. But it was still framed then about eco-design and design for sustainability for me became difficult areas to work in after about 2006, 2005, 2006, because they were then and they are still being framed within a particular economic construct, which is the neoliberal economy. So they can't go further. So that's why I got interested in ideas of participatory design and co-design and open design. I thought we needed to widen out. I should say also, as an ecologist, I trained in a transdisciplinary way. I was an environmental scientist and I specialized in plant ecology. So I learned in a transdisciplinary way. So it was a big surprise to me. I went into the design world, which I believe can be very transdisciplinary in some ways, but that the design discipline was quite hermetically sealed in where it saw itself operating in society. And it's generally operated and still continues to operate within a narrow view of economics. I've done quite a lot of work over the last 10 years about how design works with alternative economic thinking. I use fashion, for example, or the making of clothing as a way to try and demonstrate other economic relationships are possible through design. But I see all these things linked. I used a lot of terminology and adjectives in front of the word design, but they're all interlinked. But it seems, well, for me, maybe I need new language because the old language clearly isn't attracting enough momentum. It's not. And the minute I saw, for instance, after I did my eco-design handbook, I saw, what was it called? It was something like eco-chic things to buy. I knew it was all going off in the wrong direction, you know? And that's what's happened, of course. The market tries to take more radical ideas. Slow design, I remember, within a couple of years, Toyota were using an advert for their cars, slow design. And I thought, whoa, 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 that's a long way from what I'm meaning by the terminology. So we can see that terminology gets quickly absorbed. So I try and keep generating new terminology, or at least new ways of talking about some very, very old topics.
Yeah.
Does that answer? A little bit?
It's not just the terminology, is it? That's the problem.
It's the practice too.
It's exactly. It's the avant-garde eventually becomes adopted by the things it was critiquing in the first place.
Yes, this is a long
We've
cycle,
seen that
well
going round and
proven.
round. I
Yeah.
mean, it touches on what you were saying about in 2003, you were talking about all this, and then a nice bit of self-critique that what's changed or what's been the impact. And I think that to me it was not quite the elephant in the room, because a baby elephant maybe crept into the talk a few times, but as we talk about power, as we talk about the power of the economy, I think in the list there you had the vectors and you had the CEOs. I think the shareholders should be in that list as well, because I don't know what my question. I have so many linking thoughts all kind of coming together. The problem is with an event like this, there's nothing I disagree with you on, so it's not going to be a contentious debate that we have. But it's that there's a key question for me, which is transition. Yeah. And there's obviously the transition design coming out of Carnegie Mellon. I think it's a clever word, because it doesn't just talk about a utopia, which the Bauhaus at the outset did, ignoring the economic realities. It doesn't sort of just paint an ideal world. The transition suggests a route also how to get there.
Indeed, and it's interesting you mentioned transition design from Carnegie Mellon, and some of the people involved in that passed through Schumacher College, which is right next to Totnes, where Transition Town started with Rob Hopkins.
Okay.
So other people had the notion of transition before design did. But this is really the question I have with the enxada. I mean, would it be the right way to go? And I haven't got an answer to this. If we made the enxada a really popular thing that people must have, but that's not enough. They must do with it. And that involves all that knowledge I was trying to point to as well, the knowledge of using a tool, which we've lost somehow. And that's to do with the way we've structured our society and our structuring of economic models. So yeah, one little thought there, but transition, yes. Could we make this popular again to do good work on the soil and on society? Let's keep the question simpler in a sense. That's a form of transition to me. And if we agree that that sounds like a useful transition, that we care for the soil more, that we use the hand tool to rebuild our knowledge with the soil, then what is the role for us to design?
Yeah,
we have a strong role in symbolism, I believe.
Yeah, I mean, that's where the power's been, to come back to the words that you're using. And the problem with design, and I'd like to talk somehow at some point about pedagogy, because it's obviously we're in the school, and I think it's perhaps how transition most likely can happen is through
in this environment.
And particularly younger. We talked about that earlier, but going really back to young people, really young people, and reintroducing them to materiality and making, which has been lost at a lot of schools. But for me, the fundamental problem is the entrenched nature of, let's say, a 20th century version of design, of what's good, of what's a good life. And it comes through that symbolism and the marketing. But it's led to the power of companies like Apple, companies like Dyson, their ability to communicate a lifestyle and to have enormous amounts of people choosing to adopt that lifestyle. And design is at the core of that message. That for me is how do we transition from that notion of design, the teaching of that notion of design. That notion of design is a metric system that comes right through from Bauhaus, through Dieter Rams, embedded in the whole Apple message. That's for me is the interesting transition from a design point of view.
You joined up something interesting. I don't know, maybe this is also a question we can discuss in a wider sense, that objectification through design. So Apple is some kind of link to a spiritual, better lifestyle. A Dyson vacuum is a link to a more cleanly life. I don't know. We could talk about, yes, how can the enxada link people to a better life? And by the way, if we talk about both of those products, we're also talking about ideas of personalization. So the recognition that there are many lifestyles, perhaps, ways of living. I don't like lifestyle I prefer livelihoods. If you asked Apple, how do your products improve livelihoods? Well, the PR department would have to consult for some time, I think, to answer that question. The same for Dyson. How do you improve livelihoods? Because it's not just about the act of cleaning or being on a computer. In the same way that if the enxada became popular again, it's not just about how you care for your soil. It's also about how you care for your family. It's about how you care for your neighbors, for your village, how you care for the future of your neighbors, your village. Does Apple really do that through design? Are we so narrow that we can only deal with the symbolism of now and not look at a future symbolism? I don't know. Many design schools are still not even teaching basic eco-design skills. We are 20-something years on, where every single designer working with materials and products, including graphical or communication design, web-safe colors. How many designers are using web-safe colors? They use a lot less energy than... How many web designers are using web-safe colors? So we're still at a really basic level but we're keeping it then stuck in this idea of eco-efficiency. And that's not good either. After 2005, I lost any faith in this idea of eco-efficiency. So are we talking about the culture in design schools that still hasn't changed?
No.
Or...
There's the culture in design schools that hasn't changed, but I see an increasing amount of students engaging with these ideas, the ideas of situatedness, of locality, of adaptable products, of repairability, of cyclical approaches to materials and so on. There's a sense that we're preaching to the converted. I think slow food has a little bit that problem. You've got the farmers markets. The problem is typically is very well appreciated by the middle classes who have the disposable income to engage in such lifestyles. But this is the problem. It comes back to exactly what you're saying about industrial farming. On the one hand, you can see this is the connection to the food. You can have your €3 chicken and have meat every day of the week, and people will do that because they can. And I think that's where the fundamental problem lies for design, because you have the equivalent with the consumption of designed products, industrially manufactured, globally resourced, object obsolescence, things that are being replaced rapidly because people have just engaged in that consumptive lifestyle because somehow it makes them feel better.
Or they don't have time to live their lives differently.
It's time and money are the fundamental
we do come
challenges.
back to that long list of different ways of viewing time, cow time, scent time, moral time. And this conversation's always been about what we value fundamentally. When I see our neighbor, the way he used his enxada with the soil, there was so much care there, He valued his soil because his soil to him was life. Without looking after his soil, he couldn't look after himself and his family. And I saw his enxada. Maybe I'm romanticizing, but I really saw care. He wasn't even conscious. I was watching him doing, but when he planted a tree with us and I see the way he used it and the care and to give life to that tree, this is something we've lost. But can we do that through design? I still come back to the reason I picked this object, of course, is it does gives us a chance to reconnect with things which would become separated. A lot of our infrastructure today is designed to separate us from the source.
Yes.
It's designed to separate us. These new classes that are emerging through AI and the extractive industries. If we really knew, if we bought an object, it actually did this over there. That's why I think the plantational scene remains a better way to describe it. And the capitalist scene remain better ways to describe our present condition, because we're still extracting from other people's ways of living and livelihoods, and it's absent. So if design can bring us closer to a reality we have direct contact with, hence the enxada. It's a direct contact with the soil. It's not to say we can supplant the food chain systems we have. I've got some incredibly powerful interests. 4 of the biggest agricultural companies in the world in America, 2 are in Asia. There are 6 companies that control 50% of the agricultural seed market. Their power and influence is enormous. How do we change that? It has to be at the local level, I think.
Right.
We have to come back to, and I don't know, if we started thinking as a design school, how do you interact 5 kilometers in any direction from this building? That's a real change of perspective or perception. And the rest then is sensibilizing you to think about how you think, how you act, and how you produce. So this would be a radical design school today. We're only going to design within a radius of 10 kilometers.
We have that round table. We've gone a bit bigger. We've got 100 kilometers, but if you want to come back in March,
okay, then
that's
you're
the
already
question of the round table.
You're already thinking then in this way, and we have 0 kilometer food, and you know this whole principle of bringing things back locally. This is, I haven't used the adjective local design yet, but you know, it's there for use by anybody, I think, because all these adjectives make you think about how am I applying my design and who benefits and who doesn't. If we make it more visceral, closer to us, I think it's much easier to see the benefits of design, and also maybe see some accidental burdens of design, ones we don't mean to create, but we do. Yeah.
How do you think environmental agency can influence this? Because we were talking about extractivism. I think you mentioned Arturo Escobar.
Yes,
presentation.
Escobar.
Yeah, and he's talking mainly from South America, and
of course
there's extractivism in South America.
Yes,
that makes people live very hard in terms of social and political and ecology. And also, I think we can say that in South America, there's still a very strong culture which are indigenous but also local. So they have this chance, but they have also to face something very brutal. And how do you think it can influence this for design? Because it's not exactly the same situation in Europe, not yet, actually.
I agree, but what you just pointed out is a worry to me too. The cultural and political conditions that give rise to the anthropological design-oriented debate in South America seems very distant from our European setting and our histories here. But I think what it's pointing to is that we have to ask those questions how we transit here. Yes, in his book Designs for the Pluriverse, of course, he's talking about indigenous communities that have moral time. They think about 7 generations ahead. They have an intimate knowledge of their ecosystems and an intimate knowledge passed on through families. So they're not in the same place we are. And I think we have to be careful transposing those ideas across. On a pluriverse, I can agree. I want a pluriverse. This is clear. But the way we might have to do it here would be very, very different. I showed you a slide of Cuba that was enforced transition.
Which is a
it was enforced by not having oil.
Indigenous.
No, of course.
So there's maybe a link. You were talking about very popular practices in Portugal. For example, the Zapatist revolution.
Yes, of course.
I think it's not indigenous, but
no.
And
the Buen Vivir movement, and there are many others, but we have to do it in our cultural conditions. And why? Because as Europeans, we have far more responsibility. You see what's happening in COP this week. Of course, all the poorer nations are saying, well, we didn't burn the carbon you burnt, okay?
Yeah.
Our ecological footprints are nowhere near your ecological footprint, so why are we paying the price? Of course, we have no defense. But our transition here maybe is even more urgent in a sense, but maybe not just from the point of view of addressing climate warming and our European responsibilities there, but for addressing other psychological and social and political things that are happening in our culture. This kind of binary politics and the lack of collectivism in a way. And this is where I think it's very difficult for us to see how a simple act of designing can create this new glue, let's say. And if we look at what's happened with networks, and of course we might agree that a lot of amazing positive things are generated. If you go and look at open design now, if you just Google it, you'll still find you've got peer-to-peer production been going for 20 years now, and there's some fantastic stuff on there. It's a network, but it's the same network. It's the same idea of a network as social media, and not all of them are doing positive things for us. But we have to make our own transition here, I think. The question is, how can design intervene as a catalyst to start generating? I don't even want to talk about social movements, because if you look at transition towns, it had its moment in the sun, and now nobody talks about it. It was all over. It was the most read book by British politicians one summer, the Transition Town Handbook, because they all started getting worried that the transition movement was doing local things that the local politicians couldn't do. Okay, so they all started reading it. It had a blip, you know. Rob Hopkins is a very interesting character, but it hasn't gathered. It hasn't gathered momentum. And actually, he wasn't very. I remember talking to him. I interviewed him once. He wasn't very confident that design could help much. So we have another problem in design, is that the symbolic representation of design in this society here, European society, thinks of design as making beautiful products for the market. We're still in very, very early days. You see, my professional work here has been about, I wouldn't say non-market design, but it's been about designing beyond the market. And even that's an interesting phrase, designing beyond the market. Because if you said that to most ordinary people, they say, what do you mean, designing beyond the market? The market and design are one thing.
Sounds a bit post-normal.
Could be. Have to read the book.
Maybe we can switch to some.
I was just going to say this. We have a couple of people in the chat.
There's one
but
question in the chat.
We can be polite, and the people who've made the physical effort could perhaps go first. So if there's anyone in the room who has a question.
Yankee, there's a question asked 30 minutes ago on the chat, so maybe we can.
Okay, let's take that
begin
one.
with
And I
this
hope
one.
the questioner is still on the audience there.
So
What's the question?
that is before slow design or turning parks into food producing parcels. How can design address the problem of time, not having enough time to participate in this design without changing the economic system first?
Well, to answer the second part of that question, you change the economic system by actually participating in another form of economic system. So you have to have participation. Heterodox economics, which goes against mainstream orthodox economic theory, started in the 1930s. No surprise, we had a big depression in 1929. So of course people started thinking about economics different. So the heterodox alternative economists have a history of 90 years. That they're even marginalized themselves in, there's a parallel maybe with design schools, that us that talk about design as an activity for society rather than just for the market are marginalized. The heterodox economists are marginalized in most economic schools. So that's part of the challenge. I think if you look at this idea of edible landscapes, again, it has a long history. The history of permaculture is about edible landscapes, I think. There was a guy in the States, I can't remember his name now, he talked about how if every lawn, and Americans spend a lot of money on their lawns, you know, the grass areas in front of their house. was made into an edible landscape, you could reduce food imports or something by some amazing figure. But to do that, the designers need to offer the right tools. Maybe they need to also think about the spatial aspects of the space, but they need to work with other knowledges. You saw my slide, assemblies of care. The designers maybe can be the initiators of projects. Rather than waiting for projects, you initiate projects. And you become the one that pulls in the other disciplines. But you'd need somebody, if you're going to do edible landscapes anywhere, urban agriculture anywhere, you need people who know how to grow food.
Wendell Berry.
Wendell Berry, yes, of course. And many others like him. Who wrote the Sand County Almanac? I'm trying to think of the author now. This is not a new topic. Even if you look at the greening cities, Ebenezer Howard and so on, greening cities was always about, if you look at Vienna, it has a long history, a socialist city actually, maybe a bit of an outlier in Austria in many senses, but around the fringe of, when they had massive migration, I think, from Austro-Hungarian wars, they created around the city edible gardens, allotments, and people also lived on them too because there was a housing shortage. We have a long history of this. But what's our role to make it, I hesitate to use the word popular because it's got a certain ring today, popular, but how do we make it that, what is the real role of design? And I don't know. After all this time working design, what is the real role of design to catalyze a profound change in our everyday lives? There is one essay in Post-Normal Design by Zoe Anastakis in Sao Paulo. Imagine an art and design institution like this, and suddenly there's a government institution. Suddenly the government says there's no money for the teachers, for the students, nothing. They ran the school for 2 years with no money. And it became known as design in the everyday. Designing everyday design. Every day you had to design something to survive in this school. That's okay, that's a radical proposition. But we look at design as survival. And there is a book called Design for Survival, isn't there? An essay from, who is it? Architect. And this was talked about in the 60s, 70s too. Design as a mode of survival. But I like to think of design as a mode of flourishing. How can design help us find a more flourishing life?
How we define flourishing, or redefine that notion,
or redefine it. Happiness is rather ephemeral, but flourishing is a steady growing of your capacity and capability. And then we're into Amartya Sen's capability theory and how design can actually give people the tools and objects that improve their capability in life. These are simple things for me at one level, but then you have to find who are the people you work with, which is why I put the assemblages of care. When you're working as a designer or design researcher, you can deliberately choose to work with different people. This opens up different activities, I think, a crossing of thoughts and actions. So I chose to do a project with small farmers in South Tyrol. I'm not sure how far we got, but I think we used some processes in design which brought together different forms of knowledge in a way which could be digested and acted upon. So this tool allows us to act, sure. You can design different tools and they allow you to act in different ways. But to raise a point I raised in the slides, how do we go from acting individually, which is the consumer market, it's all about individualism, to acting more collectively, individually and collectively? I don't know. I'm not sure whether I've answered the question even. There's 3 questions in one.
There's another one from Armand.
Yeah.
He's here now.
Is he? Hey, I didn't see you arrive. Do you want to ask your question in person?
No.
Do you want me to do it for you?
Why not?
I won't try and do that. Why not? I won't try and do the accent. So Armand is asking, how to combine activism and plural world vision.
my first answer about activism is it can be a good thing or a bad thing. It depends on what you're being activist on. We have to remember that the early prototypes of the SS were activists. Now, I say that because activism, we can't assume that activism is always for the greater good of society. So, first of all, you maybe have to ask yourself a question about what do I stand for as an activist? Okay. And the second part was, sorry?
How to combine that with a plural worlds vision. What do you mean, a vision of plural worlds?
Yeah, well, I think firstly, I would agree with you that we don't have a vision of plural worlds, and that's why we're in so much trouble. I think we have a very monotheistic vision, global economy, only one way of doing it, and we have an utter reliance on technology as part. So our vision is purely technological and geopolitical. For the plural worlds, well, I think we could also be amplifiers of more plural voices, because another problem we have today is that the voices are not plural. So if you're a design communicator, for instance, well, through design we can communicate, but if your job is to communicate stories as a designer, then we should be looking for more plural voices. In theory, we should have got that through the internet. I don't know, it's interesting to read Tim Berners-Lee. If you read his early visions of the internet, nobody could have disagreed with it. And I think he still is he's a pluralist, Tim Berners-Lee. I think he saw the internet as an infrastructure which would allow plural voices and allow plural experiments, because we have to also think that pluralism is about trying things and not being afraid to try things. So, but how do we use activism in the context of design to create more plural worlds? Well, design has to materialize something. It has to make something in the world. I think we should be thinking more about our designs as a catalyst to do something. There's a wonderful project which I didn't show here. I don't know whether any of you know it. It's called Outside Brewery. It's a mobile brewery for brewing beer by Henriette Waal. She's a Dutch designer. And she puts a brewery on a trailer. She can take it to any community. And she has a water filter system and a bottling system, and they're all transportable. And when she arrives in a community, she asks, where are the people that brew their own beer? So she finds the local brewing community. Where are the ecologists who know what the local plants are? Where are the hydrologists who know the local water? And where are the local people that want to make a unique drink together? And she brings all these people together through this mobile, materialized brewing factory. I don't know where you got the image in your head now, but it arrives, it looks slightly technological, and they make beer from the landscape. And this, to me, is a very powerful way of thinking about plural worlds. As designers, if we prototype things or test things, I don't like prototype, it's got too many, but if we experiment with things by materializing things, even the whole world of pop-ups, you know, where we pop up in the urban environment interventions, this is a very visceral way of experiencing that. But we have to pop it up by bringing in other forms of knowledge too. That way we hybridize things. So I think we can also talk about design as a set of tools and processes to hybridize different forms of knowledge through a material experience. Because in the end, we were talking about materials earlier. I think we have to pass this hoe around. I want you all to feel the weight of the hoe. Because, yeah, we have to pass it around because
we can do it again.
You know, design is it's the feeling, okay? Maybe
It's binet.
Binet. Binet is the name.
It's a name in French. That's binet.
Who or Binet? Well, maybe it has several names because In some languages, several names.
I think Binet can be kind of articulated. It's only to remove the very upper part of the soil.
Okay, more this
Yeah,
way.
exactly. I
Yes.
think so.
This is we call it a Dutch hoe in the UK. It moves this way, not this way. But just to feel it and to understand, that's the material design, okay? If we think about experimenting with taking our designs out to different situations where different situated knowledge exists in different communities, and we act as an agent that materializes something to gather around. All my participatory workshops, I use tools which are very simple and basic. They don't have any barriers, okay? Because I want people to put their knowledge in. I think this hybridization of knowledge would be a good place to start with more plural worlds. And that's a pedagogical thing too, of course.
Did you come across Albert Borgmann's device paradigm?
No, device paradigm.
Device paradigm.
Yeah.
This for me is an often a good starting point for teaching a project.
Yeah.
What Borgmann does, he makes a separation between a thing and a device,
Okay.
using the example of in the case of a device, the central heating system.
Okay. Quite a big device.
But for the person, it's
Yeah.
not a big thing. It's a radiator with a button.
Okay.
So the device separates the system from the activity. You've got the whole infrastructural system behind a wall, hidden away, dislocated.
Oh, but this is
intangible.
nice. This is nice. Yeah.
The central heat's just, and you have no control over it, and you have little knowledge over it. Whereas the thing, he talks about the hearth, the fireplace in the home as a focal point for the gathering of the
separation.
community,
Yeah.
and that linking you to the wood
Yeah.
in the local environment, the
Okay.
gathering and the preparation of the wood, the knowledge of the fire building and the activities that go around that, and the thing being systemic, connecting you to a particular milieu. Whereas
And the device keeping the systemic part
everything's
hidden.
separate. And
Okay.
the problem for me with the majority of the design is it thinks in the terms of devices, the artifact, its form, how we
Sure.
interact with it, and all of the systemic elements, whether the material, energy, knowledge and information, etc., aren't really to be considered by the designer.
A lot of design is front end, isn't it?
Exactly.
So you're never
That's
dealing
right.
with the system, and the system itself might have quite a lot of plurality,
Exactly.
but you're only given one entry point to it.
So when you think about those two things from a pedagogical point of view,
Yeah.
teaching experience is completely different. Because if
Of
you're
course.
just teaching the facade, the
Yeah.
form, the materiality and the modes of interaction and making it sexy, there's a whole lot of knowledge that is irrelevant. You don't need it.
But in a sense, we can expand that teaching always, because you're still talking about device and a thing. But we don't talk about warmth, okay? The minute we expand it to warmth, we're also talking about clothing. We're talking about cultural habits. We're talking about food. So I think the context we give things, even when we materialize things in a way to cross knowledges, situated, we also have to think about the context boundaries. Okay, what the context boundaries we're trying to expand or join together. I do believe design can make new relations, and on a simple level, if we had a longer handle on that, it would make new relations. Okay, if we had a shorter handle, and this is what happens to the design of these enxadas, the shorter handle. I don't know if you've ever seen an axe. It's an axe that, you know, for cutting wood, but the handle's only this long. And it's used for trimming green wood, okay? Because you just use the wrist to use the weight of the axe. You don't need the leverage. So it's just a short axe, but it completely changes what you can do with it. And in a way, this is also the power of design, to show this, that a subtle intervention there on length of handle changes completely the affordance and the feeling and the knowledge you need to use the tool. So we work with tools all the time in design. We design tools as well. And I think if we're going to be activist, we could think about what tool would I like to use with a community I already know, or choose to work with a community I don't know. So I think this is how we can think about design. But ultimately, underneath all this conversation is about value, isn't it? What do we value? What values do we give to designing? Am I optimistic about activism and plural worlds?
Yes. Like just a question because we have the
And maybe it will be the last question.
excuse me.
Because no, just warning.
We have the heritage of the activism comes from the modernities. Capitalism and communism have vision globalism of the world, and they produce some way to fight.
Yes.
So the question is today how to continue to something like fight or have a combat, but to consider the fact, what you say.
Yes.
It's the world is plural, so it's difficult to have what the thing is le genre humain. It's
In a sense, both communism and fascism, they're both monocultures,
yeah,
and they cannot deal with the plurality of our world.
yes, that's right. That's
Yeah.
was
And this is the issue. So
That's the
it
issue.
fundamentally becomes a political issue. Then how we apply our design expertise, whatever that is, as practitioners in the market, we can also apply it in a certain way. I think, as practitioners in research, again, apply it in a different way, and as practitioners in various societal organizations, we can apply it in a different way. But this is our big problem today. Yeah, we have a world which is changing in plural ways, but the mono cultures of politics don't allow any response to that, and that's what makes it dangerous, in my opinion. Yeah. So don't do any binary designing. Okay, design is neither left nor right. It is across the spectrum, perhaps. Spectral design, we could talk about now.
I'll draw it there.
Okay, on this good word.
On spectral design, okay, yeah. We're going to have a drink on spectral design, yeah. I like that idea.
Well,
Well,
thank you.
Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure.
Much appreciated.
Merci bien. À tout.
Sorry, I said everybody
Thank you
else.
for the people who attended this Zoom too.
Now we can invite you to come visit us at the Gallery of Bastille for the vernissage.
Ah, great.
Right now, probably you mentioned it before.
No, I forgot,
Okay.
but now you know. It's just down the road.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yes.
And please share the slides with anybody who wants them, or you can contact me and I'll send the talk to you. Okay.
And we recorded the
Yes,
lecture. Is that possible to use it online or?
Yes.
I think we forgot to ask your permission. but-
Oh, well, I give it
Yeah, I
now.
was
Yeah.
supposed to make you something sign.
So long as you put it in plural places, okay?
We're not in the network.
Maybe your hand